are talking about Detroit Driller Killer. This one, of course, compared to your garden variety Driller Killer. And this one is directed and co-written by Matt Jaissle. And he's actually done a few very low-budget movies. Speaking of low budget, according to IMDb, the budget of this one is just $1,000. Now, of course, this is riffing on the original Driller Killer by, I believe, Abel Ferreira. This, of course, is an unofficial sequel, I guess you want to say, a little bit like the Amityville plethora of movies that come out, I suppose. Nothing really to do with the original movie, just riffing on that kind of title here. But I mean, what can you do for $1,000? Well, you'll watch this movie and you'll find out. So what is the story? So we have this guy who is ultimately a failed screenwriter, and he is living with his girlfriend. The bills are piling up. He gets offered a job, and that kind of opportunity goes away, and he ultimately snaps and becomes the Driller Killer. Kills his girlfriend, and then ultimately just kills essentially anyone who kind of walks in his path, really. Killing a variety of women initially, but then turning his attention to literally anyone that just seems to happen across his path. And that's basically your film. So, okay, let's talk about what works first of all. Now, when you're going into a movie that has a budget of $1,000, you have to have certain expectations about what you're going to see. You are not going to see a professionally well-produced movie. So please bear that in mind. I'm going to be talking in the context of this very micro-budgeted style movie. But I have to say, for £1,000, well, dollars really, this is actually a fairly impressive movie for that kind of such a low budget, if that is indeed the budget. I mean, this is going by IMDb, so you know, I don't know if that's true, but nonetheless, it's a relatively kind of well put together movie. Now, of course, the director has had some experience of making a few schlocky Gore style low budget fare before, so obviously he's relatively experienced at this point. So this is not like an amateur effort of a first film. Like, for example, I mean, what we're talking about here is things like framing, editing, sequencing, that sort of stuff. There's a reasonable, skill here in kind of your basic brick and mortar style filmmaking, if that makes sense. The basics are here in regards to, you know, how to compose a shot, lighting, that sort of stuff. So, on a technical level, I would say for £1,000, it's pretty well done. £1,000, I keep saying that. It's $1,000. It's a fairly kind of like well-made film for that kind of like budget. And obviously it has a reasonable cast, reasonable kind of like size cast here again. Now I'm assuming that really none of these people are actors professionally, but I've got to say I've seen worse acting for the most part. I mean, the acting's not great, to be honest with you, but nonetheless, it kind of like wasn't so bad, and that it was kind of off-putting in a lot of ways. There are also some quite interesting scenes here. There's a scene that really I found the most interesting is where he kind of gets in this car with this other random guy. This is like, is this guy like a fellow serial killer? And I was reminded of the movie Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, which, you know, had Henry and kind of Milo. Although it's a relatively one sort of sequence in a movie, it just kind of reminded me of that film, and when he's talking to the other guy who may or may not be a serial killer, and what he's saying could be construed a number of different ways. So that was kind of like quite a kind of a well-constructed scene. There's quite a high body count here. Obviously, the majority of the victims are taken out with a drill, although it's not the only way he kills. There are a few that just get bludgeoned to death by a wrench and things like that. And our central kind of character gives this kind of like weird, kooky performance. And I've got to say, I thought he was, his costuming was quite good, because he kind of looked like he was some weird religious nut. Now, this movie is a throwback to those kind of like those grimy, grindhouse films of the kind of the 70s. And although it is clearly a modern film, it does certainly have that style of kind of like grindhouse kind of feel to it. So if you're a fan of that very kind of low budget, you know, triple X style kind of horror movies that you got in the 70s, then yeah, again, you may want to check it out if you don't mind a very, very low budget film. But obviously, let's talk about what doesn't work. Okay, so I'm gonna put a pin in the budget for now because I think that's easy to kind of criticise this movie about. So I'm going to talk about the main thing for me, which I feel falls outside of budgetary constraints here, and that is story. Unfortunately, here the main critique I would say that I feel is a legitimate criticism that you can't say, well, it was a budgetary issue, is the fact that the story is very, very slight. So the guy it starts off relatively well with regards to story. The guy essentially snaps, and there's some commentary about how he can't remember things and things like that, which is fine. But after that point, there's really no story to it. It's just him killing a bunch of people, and it all kind of ends in this kind of underground, like rave sort of thing. But there's really no plot to it from there. It's just a bunch of scenes with him killing people. And to me, that was the movie's biggest failing. When you can't afford to do, you know, have professional actors, special effects, things like this, you can have a story that kind of is a gripping story nonetheless. And this movie ultimately doesn't deliver on that, unfortunately. So the setup isn't bad, but really after that, it doesn't really go anywhere narrative-wise, unfortunately. There are a couple of, as much as I can credit some technical achievements here for just $1,000 budget, there are still some technical issues to be had here. Some very kind of obvious kind of ADR, things like this. There are a few instances where you'll see, obviously, the amateur cast literally look at the camera, and that's happened on more than one occasion with more than one actor. You'll just kind of see them glance at the camera. So again, I'm thinking this movie was probably filmed relatively quickly and not a lot of kind of takes were done, and these takes were probably not reviewed, I should imagine, on certain things like that, because they probably would have picked that up. The gore itself is relatively slight. There's plenty of blood, you know, there's plenty of blood here, but using a kind of a electric drill, to me, was a little bit, you never really see any particularly gory moments, to be honest, and the drill seems to go through people like it would do like a knife through hot butter. You don't really ever get that there's any type of resistance with a skull and things like this, because a lot of them are headshots. And it just seems to kind of like slide into people a little bit kind of too easy. And, you know, there's a couple of instances where people aren't killed through the head and they instantly die. And again, it's just that kind of like people wouldn't die straight away from that, they would bleed out. Things like this. So, again, just not the kind of the care of and attention to have a shocking film that makes it definitely kind of feel like the B-movie that it actually is, because it doesn't try to really be a shocking and realistic film, because the violence ultimately becomes somewhat kind of cartoony. Yeah, and obviously it is a low budget movie. The budget is $1,000, so you're not going to be expecting really any high type of production value. I still am actually quite impressed with what they've managed to do for this money, but I feel just any type of general audience will just be put off by the overall kind of like just very low budget nature of it. But, you know, to me personally, I'd actually give the film credit for that, but I would imagine like the general audiences aren't going to go on IB and think, oh, it's only $1,000 budget, therefore I'll give it a pass. But so I've got to kind of like think about it like that. And therefore, I would say for the budget that it's got, it's technically an impressive movie on some levels at least. I feel its biggest failing is its lack of ambition in regards to its narrative, because that doesn't cost anything. You could have an interesting story without it costing a penny more, but unfortunately it does fail to do that. So although it's certainly an okay story, there's just nothing really happens. But if you just want to see a bunch of kills, then please knock yourself out. I'm going to give this one a 4 out of 10, because I can't legitimately say to a general audience that this is an above average film, because it isn't, because obviously it is such a low budget movie. But it's more impressive than I feel some of the other movies I've seen which do have a higher level of budgetary production value here. So I don't think it's by no means an unwatchable film. I had like an IMDb and it's got a 1.3 stars, but so you have to try and judge the movie on what is available at the time, and for $1,000, I think this is somewhat impressive at certain levels. Anyway, 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.